Welcome to the Uncut Podcast. I'm Pastor Luke, and this is
Pastor Cameron.
And this is Pastor Cameron. So, welcome to the Uncut Podcast, where we have uncut, honest conversations about Bible, theology, life, church, ministry, anything we feel like talking about. And
anything that strokes the passion or like that, stokes the fire of our conversation and our kind of our mutual, the things that we mutually like and agree with or are involved with.
Yeah, or feel like just having an interesting conversation about.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to, and I'm not sure what topic it'll have, and it'll probably be something that we don't expect where we're going to disagree.
I'm sure if we dig hard enough and fast enough, we could find something.
Oh, I'm sure. Maybe not, definitely, probably not on the big things, but on the smaller things. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we were thinking about talking about today is, COVID, everything that happened began to happen in 2020, or like this March will be like 3 years removed from the date that at least Conduit, said, hey, we're going to pause in-person services for a while.
2020 both feels far away and not far away at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reading a book the other day that was written, published, distributed, and got into my hands all post-COVID. And I was like, it doesn't seem like someone would have the ability to write a book, publish a book, sell and distribute a book, and get it into Cameron Leinhart's hands in that amount of time. But it has been, say 3 years. Mm-hmm. And a lot has changed in the world, or a lot had an opportunity to change through COVID. And those changes were not absent from the church. They were, they're prevalent in our church as well, in all churches. And one of the things, or I think the primary thing that it really changed, that COVID really changed the landscape of in churches, is the prevalence of, or what seems like the necessity now to have everything and anything that you can streamed online, offered online, so that the person who cannot be present in either the building or in the small group or at the Bible study or on a Sunday morning or whatever still has an opportunity to participate. Mm-hmm. Right. Stated in that kind of way, it feels like, oh my gosh, what an opportunity to involve more people. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's, I don't know if I remember growing up in our church, and when we had a cassette ministry. Mm-hmm. Do you remember those?
I do.
Like they'd record the sermon on a cassette, and then they'd duplicate a number of those cassettes, and then they would hand them out to people. Yep. And, that grew into, okay, well, if you don't have a cassette ministry, you're not reaching your full potential, or don't have a CD ministry, or you don't have, a podcast, right? That kind of became at least the standard. Every church, pretty much everywhere, at least had to have an audio podcast of their sermon, put it up sometime during the week on somewhere where they could listen to it. And then becoming more and more was like the standard was an audio podcast and a video recording were kind of the standards. Not every church had embraced video, but COVID it hit fast forward on the media trend in the church. Yep. And so now not only do we need to be recording and redistributing our sermons and maybe services in video and audio format, we need to be live streaming out into the world concurrently the service as it happens.
Yeah. I remember, I think my first recollection of all of that was, I don't know what it would have been, what year it would have been for you, but I was a freshman or sophomore in college, and the church that I was attending in Rochester did what I thought was an extraordinarily cutting edge thing, where it was you could order the sermon on CD. And then like, so you would order it the Sunday that it was preached, like leaving church. Oh, that was a really good sermon. I want that. And then so you go to the window and you would order it, and then next Sunday when you came back, it'd be ready for you, and so you could take it. And and I thought that was just like, that was incredible.
Right.
Like, oh my gosh, that we get to do this.
Yeah.
And then I still have upstairs in my office, I have in the lower drawer of my filing cabinet, I have the VHS tapes of like the first sermons that I preached as pastor.
Yeah, I've got. I mean, this will date the difference between when you and I were going through preaching classes. I have a thumb drive with the recordings of when I, was preaching and stuff.
So like my very first Sunday as a pastor, I have a VHS tape, recording of it. I got no way to play it. I don't own a VCR. I don't know anyone that does own a VCR. But someday, maybe we'll get it onto some sort of digital copy. And I don't know. That sermon can probably just live in the catacombs of a VHS, because there's probably not much good that's in it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, well, and growing up, like, church on TV is not necessarily a new thing.
No.
It's not. It's a pretty old thing, actually. But it existed in a really small, or for a really small subset of churches and personalities and people.
Well, because the cost of entry was so expensive.
So high.
Right.
Right.
But like what we're doing right here, right, with this podcast, these microphones, the cameras that we're using, the way we're recording and distributing it, was a relatively low barrier of entry, and like it's not that complicated. Like,
well, and this is probably 10 times as complicated as what it actually has to be for churches all over the world right now to get their services at least out.
Right.
You need a smartphone, and an internet connection, which presumably every smartphone has, and then you just need a platform, and almost everyone has Facebook, and that's a primary way that most people are connecting that message out there. And so it has taken, maybe, let's say, in the span of the last, I think generously, like 40 to 50 years, what has been something that has been reserved primarily for the biggest churches with the most resources and the most charismatic personalities to get their messages out there, get their services out there. And it's taken it down all the way to the smallest of little country churches who maybe typically wouldn't have a wide geographical impact with their message. And it's given them the opportunity to give people literally across the world access to what they're saying.
Yeah. It's, well, like, I remember I was pastoring as associate pastor in a church plant in Chicago prior and during 2020. And I've always been like a gadgety guy. I've always been I love tech, I love sound. So, I was making sure we had video recordings and audio recordings of like our service and like our sermons. And I did do we did live streaming for a bit. And we were just running it off of like my little, I think it was my iPhone 5, and like just strapping it to this pole with a GoPro mount and hitting like go live. And that's what we were doing. And I think we stopped doing it because, so few people were tuning in live. And but even with that simplicity, it was such a technical headache that we were just like, like, is this really worth it? Like, we get the sermon out within so many hours of the,
right.
So we opted not to, but then, maybe a year passes after we stopped live streaming, and that became the only way in which we could do ministry in Chicago was me and the senior pastor sitting side by side, kind of like this, staring into iPhones, and doing a whole like service, a little acoustic guitar and it was amazing how much we were able to do given the constraints of not being able to meet together. But then it was like incredibly sad. I hated that season. Was lonely.
Yeah. I thought that like in terms of that season for me, that and I want to say that I don't think we live streamed only for very long. Certainly not as long as many places did.
Yeah.
I think we started live streaming or started going. We suspended in-person services, I think, in the middle of March of 2020. And then I want to say it was Father's Day.
Okay.
So June.
Yeah.
Beginning of June. So three-ish months that we, put a big tent in the front yard. And then we literally worshiped underneath that tent for the next 4 months.
Yeah.
So but then we still live streamed out there too.
Yeah.
Right. But I remember actually and maybe this is a question that we come back to later, but is, when you said like when you first started live streaming pre-COVID, you got to the point where it was like viewership was so low that you had determined like this isn't worth it.
I think we were getting maybe one person.
Right. And that for me is an interesting like philosophical marker.
Yeah.
Is like at what point does it become worth it?
Yeah, right.
At what point does it become worth it? And so, maybe there's a more appropriate time to come back to that question because we're digging into really kind of where at least the heart of the conversation is for me, is, we're typically talking about live streaming and all of church being online, everything that we can, Bible studies, whatever.
Well, we get
announcements and
we get that question anytime we do any event, ongoing thing. Will it be live streamed? Will it be recorded? Will it will I be able to access it?
Yeah.
Without being
here. And so we're typically having the conversation within the parenthesis of this is such a great thing. And like one of the guys that I don't know like how hook, line, and sinker you take all the things that Craig Groeschel says or does, And I mean, for those who are listening or watching who might not know who Craig Groeschel is, he's probably one of the most influential Christian pastors in the United States, maybe the world.
Yeah, I think he leads one of the most influential churches.
Yeah.
I don't think he's like the best known preacher. I think that falls to a couple other people. But as far as what his church does,
well, and probably his overall like leadership influence,
right?
Not necessarily his preaching influence, but his like leadership influence is probably second to none.
Yeah, that's where his significant. So
Right.
he is someone that you pay attention to in the church world because often where they go, the world goes, or at least the church world goes. And like for context, his church is the church that created the Bible app.
Yes.
The YouVersion Bible app that you
probably have
on your phone is what his church made and made publicly free for everyone. Yeah. So like,
and you and I listen to his podcast every month. I listen to all his interviews. I read pretty much all of his books. And while it's impossible to really know him truly as a like person, all signs point to genuine, caring, faithful man of God, pastor of the largest church in America.
Yeah.
So, But he is a big proponent of like, well, one of his like catchphrases is, if you want to reach people that no one is reaching, you have to do things that no one is doing.
Yes.
So like his church, Life Church, based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, is, they have, I don't want to say they've pioneered, but they're certainly on like the front leading edge of doing things like virtual reality church.
Mm-hmm.
So like if you have an Oculus,
right. Church in the metaverse.
And about how like he feels like it's important for Life Church to have a influence there or a presence there or whatever. And I mean, I'll go on record to say, like, I'm only 40 years old, and so, but like I'm a little bit of an old soul in terms when it comes to like technology and gadgets and stuff like that. Like, I have the things that are really the gadgety things that I like, but they're not generally technological. And so there's a little bit of stuff like VR church and stuff like that I just don't understand and I don't get. And maybe that's on me. I'm asking it to do things without really understanding what it actually is. But anyway, so this is something that I have, I think, a little bit of a fundamental disagreement with Craig about, because he, I think, would say, like, church is in as many ways, in as many places, in as many environments, as many modalities as possible. Like, the more, the better.
Yeah.
And while on the surface, I, like, of course, wouldn't disagree with that. Like, yeah, we want to reach the people that are in the metaverse, hiding away there. I think it leaves some things out. I think it leaves some considerations out. That the whole question that begs the question of like, is the iteration of everything online in church, every service, every Bible study, small groups, all those things. Is it a good thing?
Carte blanche.
Is it a good thing? Or is it sometimes good and sometimes bad? Or is it neutral? And I have some thoughts on that. But I'm a little curious as to what you would say about that being different, a little bit different personality for me in terms of like the gadgety techno world, type of thing.
Because I got an Oculus,
right.
I don't spend much time in the metaverse, but I've always been kind of like, let's see what we can do. And and even just my church background, I come from a very missionally minded church background. Like, that's just like reach the people, right? I think, like, for me, I was kind of having this conversation pre-COVID through, like, the church has been wrestling with this question, I think, for a good decade or more, ever since the advent of screen preachers. The advent of having
multi-sites,
multi-site, and by that I don't mean just like, we talked about big churches that have multiple places where they meet, and specifically there's a whole bunch of different ways that can be done, but specifically the way in which there's multiple places where one church meets, and only one of those places has a physical in-flesh preacher.
Yeah.
The rest of the places have maybe a pastor on staff who does like announcements, but then everybody looks up to a big projector screen and they're either watching...
They tune in
to the main campus, and they're watching either live streamed or slightly delayed or an hour off or whatever. The sermon that the main primary, usually well-known pastor was delivering. And that has become a fairly common model. I don't know if it's sticking around, but like it's been around for a while, and I feel like has kind of that discussion around that modality of church has kind of gone to the background because of just the prevalence of streaming. But the question is like, is that different does it matter whether or not you are at like the main campus or if you're at a satellite campus where you're watching the screen preacher? And I have like a couple reflections on that. And I think that points to where I kind of go with streaming. And that's the first is that if you go to any of those churches, all of those churches don't have a live in-person preacher, but they almost always have live in-person bands.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were to like talk to someone and they were like, oh, like it doesn't make a difference that like, that the preaching streamed. I'm like, okay, would it bug you if you went to a church and you had to watch on the screen the band play?
Mm-hmm.
And most people pre-COVID would say, oh,
yeah, I don't want to do that.
I don't want that.
Yeah.
Like I want to actually be there with the worship.
I want to feel the emotion.
I want to feel the emotion. Yeah. I want to, I'm like, well, we can turn it up. Right. They're like, no. Like, I want to be in the room with the worship. Like, there's like, that would be a pretty common response for most people. And so what I would normally say if someone responded that way is, so what you're telling me is that presence does matter.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't mean that screen preaching's wrong, but it does, for me at least, point or indicate that there is something significant to being present.
Yeah, I think it also says something about the way that we view the different aspects of a worship service.
Yeah.
That the worship is something that we want to participate in with people. The preaching is something that we want to receive as a piece of content.
Yeah. Well, we've commodified preaching.
Yeah, right.
If anyone like you, maybe you, but mostly myself, like I at one point was consuming podcasts of sermons like crazy.
Oh, yeah.
And outside of the context of churches I've never attended to, pastors I've never met, people who never know me, and I'm listening to their podcasts.
There's some sermons I don't miss from preachers. It doesn't matter. I never miss an Andy Stanley sermon. I listen to every single one of his sermons.
Do you really?
I just love Andy Stanley.
That cracks me up. But we've been doing that for a long time. And so we've kind of acclimated to that. Yeah. And so maybe a screen preacher or maybe streaming online the sermon, like that doesn't feel so strange because we already kind of have been doing that with cassettes, CDs, podcasts. And I think the same response is kind of held true for people who have watched church at home on YouTube, on Facebook through COVID this current season, is most of them say like, yeah, like the sermon's fine, but like the thing I miss the most is like the worship, right? Which like we could go on a whole tangent there because I don't love referring to musical worship as worship, but like
it's a term we got to use for familiarity.
Right. But like they miss the musical aspect. They miss singing corporately and being in the presence of that. But they don't necessarily feel that quite as keenly with the sermons. I kind of think it's a little bit neutral, but I think it's a little bit of context, reason, intention, a little bit of calling too.
Really?
Maybe. Like I think like some people, like I can look at a pastor and I can say like, all right, the way that you're executing ministry is not the way I would execute ministry. And that's got to do with my personality. It's got to do with like what I feel like I'm particularly called to do, the way I feel convicted about doing ministry. But like if it's like a secondary issue, like it's not for me. Like, but I could say like I like Craig Rochelle, like VR church is something I just like I don't like. But I would kind of just like say like I don't know. Yeah. So I would kind of put it that way.
Here's my thing though. It's like I don't know. And I don't know. I'd be willing to bet. Craig, if you're listening to this podcast, send us a comment and let us know which one it is.
Yeah.
I don't know that Craig would say that he feels personally called to engage in that type of pastoral ministry. I think that what he would say is that a foundational theology of the church would lead us to believe that that's an area that we have to be in. And I think there's a distinction there.
Yeah.
Because if we approach the issue with no, like the church should be in all places, in all ways, in as many, like in as many environmental modalities as it can, then it doesn't really, like personal calling then really
doesn't matter.
Doesn't function into the equation.
Right.
It should be then it becomes a question like, well, not Craig, why are you in VR? Why are you in the metaverse? The question gets reversed on us. Is like, well, why aren't you? Why aren't you? If it's about personal calling, I think that worries me a little bit, because then we're talking about like, much of ministry, or at least that aspect of ministry, is leveraged against the personality of the one at the helm. And yeah, that could take the church in a very positive direction into areas of ministry that are really important and valuable, but it can certainly, we've all seen it do the opposite, where a church is like a dog with a bone on a pet project that just reeks of dishonor to the Lord.
Yeah.
So I wonder about the question of like whether or not it is calling, or how it functions in terms of the nature of the church. And it's maybe a little bit of an unfair question to ask, or an unfair question to come hard down on a singular answer, because I don't even think it's a fair question to ask, well, if Jesus had access to Facebook and streaming equipment, would the Sermon on the Mount be live streamed?
I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Would he live stream his teaching? Yeah. It's fun. I think it's fun to have conversation about like conjecture around that. What would, WWJD, what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
But that's really all it is. It's conjecture. We couldn't say with any form of like authority that this is definitely what Jesus would do.
Yeah.
It's like yeah. I don't know. So
well, like maybe to push a little bit, like I had a friend. He was a communications guy, and he was always telling me, he's like, Luke, medium is the message. Yeah. So he was always just like, and he meant it kind of not in an embracing way, but like in a like the medium through which you transmit a message, if it's not appropriate, will override and destroy the message. If you're communicating it through
it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah. A little bit. And so like there is like podcasts, videos, like watching on a screen, like is a pretty like information transfer that way.
Yep.
It's pretty good. And like if we were to kind of maybe take all the different aspects of a Sunday service and say like kind of classify up kind of different parts of the service and say, well, the sermon is probably the most information heavy, involves the mind.
Yeah.
And so it was probably maybe just like, again, I'm looking at this, I'm not asking any spiritual questions right now. I'm asking like hyper practical questions. The message itself is probably pretty well suited to that medium. The worship, not quite so well, because it's meant to be participatory, and it's hard for us all not to feel like we're like kind of watching Blue's Clues or Dora the Explorer. The map, right? When we're like trying to like, that's my experience. I don't know. Some people like love worshiping along on television. That's fantastic. I have a really hard time with it. I feel like I'm like participating with Blue's Clues.
Yeah.
And so like for me, participating in musical worship over a screen is near impossible for me. Because the screen is primarily a receiving, it's not participatory.
It's voyeuristic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so having asked no spiritual questions in that, just thinking like practicality about the content and the way we want people to interact with it, there's the sermon does lend itself to the medium of streaming, recording, and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But that does bring back to a question of like, does physical presence matter enough? Like, I don't know. Like, is there like, I want to hear your thoughts. I've been doing a lot of the talking, but I want to hear your thoughts now. Like, is attending church online just as good as attending church in person?
No.
Okay.
Like categorically no. And I would say like the reason that I would say no to that is because I think it is impossible to overstate the importance of personal relationship with other believers in a person's journey of faith with Christ, Christian faith. To backtrack a little bit into like piggybacking on what you said, there are always going to be certain mediums of or aspects of, let's say, I'm just talking about Sunday worship, that are more suited or more appropriate for the medium of capture and send out.
Right.
Because they do, as a standalone, they do function in a way that can be probably useful. But I think that says also a few things about, and I don't think you're not saying this.
Yeah.
You know?
I'm only revealing kind of half of my hand here.
Sure. Right. That it maybe betrays a little bit of the way that in general we approach and view the worship service as a whole.
Yes.
Or the gathered community. But I think we've underplayed our hand in, modern Christianity at the importance of the lived experience of doing the Christian faith, walking the Christian walk, living the Christian life alongside others. And we've been slowly, over a long period of time, but it seems like in the past decade or so, like we've supercharged the reality of more and more personal isolation from one another that has created a break in actual like person-to-person relationship, right? That, I mean, we look no further than like the comment section on any social media post or any YouTube article or any YouTube video or news article or whatever, right? And even myself feel more free to say things that are out of character for me in that medium than I would if something that I'm commenting on you right now, right? Or anyone else that's in like actual personal, physical proximity and relationship with. And so the growing chasm of actual physical presence and actual physical relationship takes, I think, sometimes our character to a place of not seeing other people as actual people, and just makes them kind of like things out there, right? And I think if I were to distill everything maybe down into one, primary thought as it pertains to like, is the streaming revolution of everything a good, bad, or neutral thing? I think that there are aspects of it that are good, but I would say that there needs to be a heavy, very, very serious warning for the church to not cheapen actual physical, human, eye to eye, face to face, hand to hand, all the voices in one room, community with one another, right?
Yeah.
And I think we could do some work even theologically to trace back the meaning and the usage of both the Greek and Hebrew words that they use to communicate like a community of faith or a called out people. Never imagined that they would live in isolation and see that as like a suitable
substitute
for the actual like gathered community where we do sing in one voice and we do have one faith, one baptism, one Savior and God and Father over us all. And so, candidly, there have been times where I've considered as a pastor here at Conduit, at least, of saying, I would not because it's practically difficult, because we can make it happen, but from a philosophical or theological standpoint, like saying, are we doing a disservice to the nature of and to the nature of actual Christian community by saying, oh, if you can't be with us, just watch here. It's like
it's the same.
It's the same thing. It's not the same thing.
Yeah.
And there are, we had this conversation. We've had this conversation before in regards to like watching our live streams and seeing who comments and seeing, hearing people say at some point, out at the coffee shop, oh, I watched you guys online this week.
Yep.
And we're like, we had no idea that this person was watching.
No.
Yeah. And it leaves me saying like being like almost like hyperventilating in my soul about like I feel the weight of responsibility for pastoral leadership in their lives without ever knowing who they are.
Right.
Without never looking them in the eye. And I feel like they're just looking through like a peephole in the door of actual authentic Christian community. I know others who say, who live up here in Jamestown will say, hey, what church do you go to? And they're like, oh, I watch a church down in Florida every Sunday.
Yep. That's becoming more and more.
Like my pastor is in Florida. Like, no, your TV show is hosted in Florida.
Yeah.
But where's your community?
Right. Well, if we were to put this, like, if we were to rewind 5 years and we were to ask somebody, what's your church? And they would say, oh, such and such pastor on television at 11 o'clock at night.
Right.
Like anybody of any like real theological understanding of what the church is would say, no, it's not.
Right.
Right. That's not your church. Right.
Right.
Right. 'Cause church is not a building. Church is not a live stream. Church is not a channel you subscribe to. Church is a community made up of people that know you,
yes.
that gather together, worship Jesus, and practice the sacraments.
Yeah.
Like,
and go out on mission.
Go out on mission. Yeah. That is ecclesiology 101.
101. Yeah.
Right. And so now we're a little bit more accepting of maybe an answer we would not have swallowed 5 years ago.
Right.
Right. There is like,
I just don't want it to be a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
Well,
so there was something interesting that happened right when COVID struck. So I've done counseling. I've done counseling for a lot of years, and like personal counseling for me. I'm not counseling people. I'm coming in receiving counseling. And during COVID, right, could no longer meet in person with my counselor at the time, and we switched to doing online counseling. Telehealth has become like a massive thing, right, because of COVID. But I remember switching from doing in-person counseling with my counselor and switching to doing, I think we were doing Zoom at the time. Everybody was on Zoom. I received a waiver from the counseling center and from my counselor I had to sign. And part of that waiver included that I acknowledged that the therapeutic benefit of being counseled online was not as significant or was going to be to a lesser degree than when I was meeting with my counselor in person. And I'm assuming that that's tied to some study. I'm not a counselor, but assuming that that statement is tied to a study that physical, actual presence with a counselor has been shown to provide better care, better therapeutic results than over a screen. And I had to sign a legal thing acknowledging that that was a fact and that I knew I was going to get a subpar counseling, not because my counselor was changing or I was changing, what we were talking about was changing. Nothing changed except for the fact that we weren't in the room together anymore.
And obviously for them to have that document ready and for you to sign, like it's been a well-established principle.
Yes.
That the physical presence of another human being in the room with you is a therapeutic advantage over staring at a computer screen.
So if it matters in counseling, by golly, it ought to matter in how we worship.
I would think so.
It's kind of at least my argument there. So I'll reveal my whole position. I think that streaming, recording, all of that is great as a substitution when we can't have the actual thing. So if we have someone who's quarantining, we have someone who's maybe a shut-in, someone who's unable to be physically present.
They're sick.
They're sick.
They're traveling.
They're sick. They're traveling.
Right.
Live streaming the service is the best thing you can have.
Agreed.
I get it. I would still maybe if you're traveling, my preference would be for you to just participate in another church that if you can while you're traveling. I think there's benefit to that. I think we get to see with different eyes, how different congregations. I think that's beneficial, but live streaming that's the best thing that you can get apart from actually being physically present with a church. And then there's that. I see that as an appropriate, okay usage of it. I see also it functioning as a front door to a lot of people. Prior to COVID, I know that I think the statistic was somewhere people would watch 3 to 5 sermons of a church before they would come and step foot in for the first physical in-person visit they would come. That was if you were going to go looking for a church, looking for a place to come, you're exploring faith, before you ever came to a church, you were listening to a couple of sermons. You were just trying to get all the information you could out of the website, trying to build up a lot of confidence and then come in. And so now live streams, service recordings, all of that functions as a front door, as it were, a bit of an entryway of saying, okay, well, before I get up early, get myself put together, why don't I just see what this church is about and see if there's because you can go to a gazillion different church websites. They all have the same thing on the I believe statement. Yeah. They all have the same mission statements. Yeah. It's all the same. So when you're actually genuinely looking for a new church,
you can see it. What do the people wear? What's the culture, the demeanor there in the room? Yeah.
And so and that's what I did when I was job hunting, or when I've moved and I've needed to find my own personal church. I went through their websites, went through their social media, and I tried to find as much as I could about the church before I would take a whole Sunday to go. Because if you visit 4 different churches and trying to find a church that you're going to make a home, that's a whole month of because it's not like you can go to 5 churches in a single Sunday physically. So I see all of that as somewhat, I can see that as a positive value added. But the area in which I become vastly uncomfortable is the perpetual, I have the opportunity to be at church.
They live 5 minutes away, but they're just sitting on the couch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or they live 20 hours away and there's a church down the street. I I would, and I've talked with people who were over in countries where faithful churches are hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
And, and my recommendation to someone in that situation is find the best church you can find and supplement maybe with another church, but don't make an online church your home
Mm-hmm.
if you can.
Yeah.
Like I think being with people, physically taking communion, which like is its own like whole topic of like, the Christian world in which we live in and the church type of churches that you and I come from, like preaching's the significant thing that happens on Sunday. But for the large mass majority of history, communion
yeah,
was the single most important thing that happened on a Sunday.
Well, it was the proclamation of the gospel.
Yeah.
That the Eucharistic liturgy was and is the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ to people.
And
yeah,
you have to be physically present.
You have to be physically present. Yeah. I want to be and I think it should, I want to work extra hard to be clear here that this is not a treatise against online things.
No, we're not.
In as much as it is like, it's kind of defaulting to that, because what I'm actually trying to say is my main point is not that like technology bad, right. What I'm saying is that there is, if you are a person who earnestly and genuinely desires to follow Jesus closely, to grow in your faith, that there is no substitute for the physical presence of the community of faith.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no substitute for, relationships are the currency for change.
Yeah.
Like they are the place where change happens.
Yes.
And there's just no substitute for that. And so as a person or as a pastor who like with all of my being and with all of my life and with all of my energy and gifts and all of that, all of my calling wants to see people genuinely transformed to the image and likeness of Jesus Christ, to live like Jesus, to love like Jesus, to serve like Jesus. It leads me to a place of saying, yes, online everything has its benefits. However, there is no substitute for participating in a community of faith. It becomes like the church becomes a laboratory for how to live like Jesus lived, how to love like Jesus loved, how to serve like Jesus served. It's impossible to know how to forgive if you're never around people who could hurt you.
Or people who need to be forgiven.
Right. It's impossible to know how to serve, how to humble yourself in service before the Lord, without surrounding yourself with people who you may consider to be lesser than you, right? Or that you have an opportunity to serve. It's impossible to know how to live like Jesus in isolation, because Jesus lived in relationship.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in relationship with people who betrayed him, who loved him, who caused problems for him, who served him, whom he served. And so if we are going to pursue life, love, and service like Jesus did, then we need to be in relationship with others. And the church is messy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the church is not because that's one of the questions like I was going to pose to you is like, what would you, as a pastor, what would you say to someone who said, no, I think this is good enough for me to just sit home and watch. Like, I suppose this is like getting a little bit into maybe another topic about like church hurt and like the reasons the reasons why someone would choose
to stay
home rather than to be in relationship or community with others, what would you say maybe to a person? That's probably a pretty long answer, but
yeah, I mean, briefly, I would just say, like, if I was talking to an actual flesh human being, right, I'd have a pastoral response. Sure. I would say, like, tell me about. Honestly, what I would want to do is I'd want to just, like, tell me your story, and in telling their story, I would want to, like, hear the hurt, I want to receive it, I want to hold it, I want to do all of those things. I want to even apologize. I want to maybe speak truth. What would Jesus say? What would have Jesus have rather the church have done? Right? All of those things. But in doing that is illustrating the very point of the church. Right? If I have this conversation with somebody and they're like church hurt, and I talk with them and I apologize and I seek to point them to Jesus amidst that hurt, and if that's effective, well, the thing is that the reason that happened is because we sat down and we had a conversation face to face. The point of the church is that, like, they're not getting that. The thing that hopefully at the end of that conversation, my prayer would be that they would feel a little bit of healing, a little bit of, like, recognition, maybe a little bit balm on that wound. They didn't get it from watching church online. No. They got it from the physical administration of someone who is prayerfully trying to be Jesus to them in that moment. That's what church is. The place where you experience healing, restoration, and redemption for the hurt that you've experienced in church can only happen in church, not by yourself. And also the greatest commandments of love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself cannot fully be done by yourself. In isolation. You can't love your neighbor as yourself without your neighbors. Yeah.
Do you think there's room in this conversation to bring in some form of, like, incarnational theology?
Yes.
So,
I mean, that's like the core of that's the deeper core of what we're
of ecclesiology, yes. Really. So, yeah, like, so the idea there then would be that, God in his sovereignty and in his transcendence could have, by divine fiat,
right,
do this, said this, arranged the pieces of life and eternity in a certain way, and then just been, like, hands off, isolated from humanity.
Right.
Yeah,
like if we take God's omnipotence, his all powerfulness, his control of all things, God could have snapped his fingers, said humanity is saved.
Yeah, or this is what's going to, like this, or this, like salvation, forgiveness.
Right. And he could have been done. Yeah. But instead became human.
He became flesh, right? Exactly. The fullness of, as Paul says in Colossians 1, like the fullness of God was wrapped up in who Jesus was. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen the one and only. We have seen his glory, the one who comes from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. And so there was a unsatisfactory relationship in transcendent isolation between God and creation. It was not satisfactory, right? And so God, satisfied the isolation, right? That is brought about by sin, right? And offered his very presence in his son Jesus to walk with us, to be with us, and through faith in Jesus, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, like the relationship between us and our Heavenly Father, between God and us, can be, like it's intrinsically, like, inseparable through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. So I think that there's even like the deeper, I think God gives us an example that life is built for relationship, close relationship, not isolation. And that while you may have relationships in other places, well, I have relationships at work or my family or whatever, right? That, again, there is no substitute for the relationships that we have and the unity that is proclaimed through a common faith in Jesus Christ.
Yep.
So
the early, we'll go super, the early church, one of the big things that's in the New Testament, I don't think it's not named using the term Gnosticism, but that's what a lot of Paul's letters are addressing is this early Christian heresy called Gnosticism. The simplest way of describing that is simply that the spiritual is more important than the physical, right? That we need to somehow
escape this world,
escape the physical body to become spiritual beings. And the funny thing is that we've kind of forgotten how much the early church fought against that heresy. And we are Gnostic.
Or we're just never told.
Or we're just never told, right? Yeah. For some people listening, they might just be like, what is Gnosticism?
Yeah. You spell it with a G, actually. Gnostic.
Right. So it's an old heresy, but it's very prevalent. Me and you often use the term of we're not just brains on sticks. Mm-hmm. A lot of times the way that church ministry is done, and the reason we don't feel comfortable with someone just choosing to exist in an online church way is because you're not just a brain receiving information. Mm-hmm. You have a heart, you have a soul, you have a physical body. God created all of those things, is redeeming all of those things. And at the end of all things, we will have physical bodies. Mm-hmm. Or something also to be reminded of is that Jesus Christ right now
has a physical body.
Jesus didn't become spirit again. He remains his physical body with his physical wounds.
His body was resurrected.
Right.
The resurrection is the bringing back of what was physical into existence.
So physicality matters.
Touch matters.
Mm-hmm. And by knowingly choosing to disembody ourselves through technology is unincarnating the church.
Yes. Yep.
That's a really harsh way of saying it, but I think it's a true way of saying it.
I agree.
So, but I just to kind of bring us back to what I think is kind of the core here is not so much that you and I are taking a back to all technology or to streaming itself.
No.
What we're hoping to do, and maybe I think the clarity that this conversation's maybe created for both of us is that what we are advocating for is a positive, clear understanding of presence, space, and the physicality of the church. Mm-hmm. It's not that we don't want people to ever watch a church online for any reason. Mm-hmm. It's that we want people to understand why being here, being together is important, beneficial, healthy, and necessary for being the church.
Yep, 100%. Like I said, it's not, I don't want to poo-poo all technology because
we're using it now.
You're listening to it because of it, right? Mm-hmm. And we'll press the go button on the live stream this weekend, and we're talking about options for Bible study, capture, and so that we have that content. And so it's not that. It is, once again, I'm not seeking to devalue the use of technology in worship in particular. I'm seeking to elevate the understanding and the importance and the priority of physical presence in the community of faith as a way in which to experience the presence of God with those who are seeking to walk with Jesus, to receive in an incarnational way, not just a content way.
Yeah.
To receive in an incarnational way the proclamation of the gospel, and to live in relationship with others who are in the community of faith. So,
yeah. Well, I think that's plenty for today.
I think, that's a little bit of content. Of course, there's lots of nuanced perspectives on this.
Yes.
There's 100 different things you could disagree in about that, and that's fine. The whole purpose of the podcast is uncut. Not.
Right.
We can't deal with every single nuance, although we may understand them and have wrestled with them ourselves. But
Right.
You might be listening or you might be watching and you might say, hey, I would really like to hear what your thoughts are about this topic or about this idea or this cultural phenomena or this aspect of faith or theology or whatever. And so we have created an opportunity or a pathway for you to do that. It's a mailbag. And it's a really easy, it's a phone number that you text, and we get those texts, not to our personal phones, but we get those texts, and then when we have a full mailbag, whatever that means, we'll break it out and we'll in an uncut way without having prepared ahead of time extraordinarily or anything like that. We'll deal with those questions and try and get some of those things answered for you, at least in the best way that we know how. So that's that number. If you'd like to send a question to the mailbag, is 716-201-0507. And we'll keep your name anonymous unless you want us to say who you are, give you a shout out online or something like that. Yeah. But as you're listening to this, if you find it to be helpful or beneficial, or if you just want more people on your team to flame us away for everything that we've said today, make sure you like and share this on your social medias, subscribe in all the places that you listen, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Share it with your friends and your family. We appreciate you spending the time to be with us today. Mm-hmm. And listening to this use of technology to proclaim things of the gospel that we just talked about for a whole episode. So thank you.
Yep. We'll see you all next time on the Uncut Podcast.